Here's a 25-marker model answer suitable for A-level economics students. So the question I've written has a short extract, followed by the question itself. I'm not going to go through the details of the short extract, but here are a few key points from there. The extract mentions plans for day-to-day spending for the government to increase. It also mentions plans for increases to spending on capital projects. So day-to-day spending might mean things like wages for civil servants working in the public sector, and capital projects could include things like building new infrastructure. And the question is here. Evaluate the view that increasing government spending is likely to improve macroeconomic performance. Here's a quick essay plan with the model answer coming up right after. In the introduction, we might just define macroeconomic performance, what that means in terms of objectives. Then our first analysis point, or what I'll call A1, let's argue that increasing government spending will improve macro performance. And we'll argue this by showing that AD increases, and that leads to a multiplier effect with a relevant diagram. And this leads to economic growth, one of the main macroeconomic objectives. And evaluation point 1, or I'll call it E1, this depends on the position of the economy on the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, and we'll see that later. But analysis point 2, I'll argue this will not improve macroeconomic performance if we increase government spending. Increasing government spending could increase the budget deficit. I mean higher government borrowing, and that can mean higher debt interest payments and possibly the need to tax more to pay out on that debt interest or pay for the government spending. For the second evaluation point, I'll argue that some parts of government spending may actually increase tax revenue and reduce the budget deficit, challenging the assumption that government spending always leads to higher budget deficits, for example, with healthcare. And in conclusion, I'll make a judgment that says government spending is likely to boost macroeconomic performance, provided the funding is used to boost the supply side of the economy. But this depends on the level of interest rates and how that extra spending is funded. A quick, short introduction. So this introduction, I just define one key term, macroeconomic performance, can be measured through the macroeconomic objectives. And then I define the macroeconomic objectives such as sustained economic growth, full employment, a low stable rate of inflation, and current account balance. So in introduction generally, we're looking to define 1 to 2 key terms and then get straight to answering the question. You can add more here if you like, but the most important thing is to get into writing the main body of the essay. Let's now do the first analysis paragraph. And to do this, we'll start off by showing the diagram. An increase in government spending is going to increase aggregate demand because government spending is a component of AD. So AD is going to shift right. In this diagram, the higher government spending shifts AD right from AD to AD1. But there's also a multiplier effect, which is going to shift AD again to the right from AD1 to AD2. And what happens when we take those all together? Well, the price level increases from PL1 to PL3, and real national output, or real GDP, increases from Y1 to Y3, so we get an increase in economic growth. That's going to be the diagram that we're going to be explaining in our analysis point. Let's now talk through that diagram. So we'll start with stating our point, which is that an increase in government spending could improve macroeconomic performance by generating economic growth. And we'll give an example. So the UK government plans to increase government spending on investment projects in real terms by an average of 1.8% a year from 2025-26 to 2029-30. Now let's explain that initial AD shift. So government spending is a component of AD, and we can give the AD equation here. So AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So increasing government spending on hospitals, for instance, increases AD, shifting the AD curve to the right from AD to AD1. And now we'll explain the multiplier effect to further strengthen our analysis. So this could then cause a multiplier effect where an initial increase in government spending leads to an even larger increase in AD and real GDP. But how does that multiplier effect actually work? Well, the extra spending on new hospitals leads to a construction company paid to build them, increasing their revenue and profit. This gives the construction firm more money to pay its workers, so wages rise, leading to higher consumption and a further rise in AD. As a result, AD shifts further right from AD1 to AD2. So altogether, when we combine the initial effect of higher government spending and the multiplier, we get this massive overall shift in AD from AD to AD2. Altogether, there is an increase in the price level from PL1 to PL3, and crucially for our point, an increase in real GDP from Y1 to Y3, resulting in economic growth in the UK. So that link back to the macro objective, the question about macro performance at the very end of the question. How can we evaluate this point? Well, we could consider where the economy is on the Keynesian AS curve. And you can imagine the economy could be on this point here, point A, where this AD curve is really high and we're nearly at full employment level of output. What would happen if AD shifts right in that case? Well, if AD shifts right from 83 to this new AD curve 84, then there wouldn't be much of an increase in real national output, and there'd just be higher inflation. That's the intuition for our evaluation point. We're going to explain it now. You could draw this to show the evaluation point if you like, but you don't have to. You could also explain it in words as I'm about to do. So this is how the evaluation would look. However, this depends on the position of the economy on the Keynesian AS curve. So starting with a depends on point. And now let's use some context. During the early 2020s, the UK unemployment rate fell to 3.6%, which could suggest the UK economy had little spare capacity at the time. And that would put the UK economy on the vertical part of the Keynesian AS at that point A we discussed earlier. In this case, a shift right in AD from 83 to 84 would simply lead to higher inflation without increasing the economic growth rate. So we're explaining the implication of the Keynesian area supply curve for the point in the question. Higher AD, in this case, would just bid up wages without increasing production levels as firms poach workers from other firms. So workers are just moving around between different firms, but they're not actually increasing the amount of production in total in the economy. As a result, increasing government spending may not lead to higher economic growth, linking back to the question. Here is my second analysis paragraph. I'm not going to use a diagram for this one, so I'm going to go into quite some depth talking through the analysis. My point is that increasing government spending may worsen macro performance by leading to higher government borrowing. Why might it lead to higher government borrowing? Well, increasing government spending may increase the budget deficit for the UK government, which stood at 4.3% of GDP in 2025, getting that example in there. As a result, government debt, which was 94.3% of GDP in 2025, may increase, leading to higher debt interest payments by the UK government. And the government, having to pay out more debt interest, incurs an opportunity cost. What does that mean? Well, the government may have to forego spending on other goods such as education. This could reduce the level of human capital in the economy, shifting the UK's productive potential, or the LRS, inwards, slowing the trend rate of economic growth. So I've explained the debt interest and opportunity cost point. Now I'm going to add further explanation on the possible effect of higher taxes. So moreover, the government may decide to raise tax rates such as national insurance to pay for the extra government spending and prevent a rise in the budget deficit and national debt. The rise in employers' national insurance contribution rates of 15% in April 2025, effectively a tax on hiring workers, may reduce the incentive to hire workers. This could reduce demand for labour and increase the unemployment rate. So note the links to the question with the macro objectives. I've mentioned the unemployment rate increasing, and I've also mentioned the rate of economic growth possibly falling due to this opportunity cost point. My second evaluation point, I'm going to consider that this might depend on where the government spending is allocated. So, for example, government spending on healthcare could make workers healthier, and so workers would have fewer sick days and they would be more productive at work, so productivity rises, shifting LRAS to the right. This could increase trend growth rate for the UK economy above the 1.25% a year. That's some good context, leading to higher profits for companies and incomes for workers, increasing corporation tax and income tax revenue, and helping to reduce the budget deficit. So more government borrowing may not be required. So I've explained how this can actually reduce the budget deficit and linked it back to our previous analysis point, and showing how this evaluation point undermines the claim that high government spending necessarily leads to a high budget deficit because of this kind of supply side policy, such as government spending on healthcare. Let's conclude. And for the conclusion, remember the question. We want to answer the question using the wording of the question. So I'm going to argue that an increase in government spending, as in the question, if spent on areas with supply side benefits, is likely to improve macroeconomic performance. So I'm listing that wording from the question to show I'm answering the question for the UK economy. Now, the next step is to justify the answer. So why do I think it's likely that increasing government spending is likely to improve macro performance in this answer? Well, increasing government spending on healthcare is likely to shift both AD and LRS to the right, leading to sustained economic growth without an increase in inflation in the long run, avoiding a trade-off. Now, after that, I'm going to try to evaluate the judgment. So what might my answer to the question depend on? Well, the success of an increase in government spending depends on the level of interest rates. Interest rates are at a higher level of 3.75% as of May 2026, compared to the 0.1% figure in 2020. And so the cost of further government borrowing has increased since 2020. So the increase in government spending must have a higher rate of return to outweigh the added borrowing cost. And those interventionist supply-side spending policies by the government could provide this return through higher trend growth, boosting tax revenue over time. And if you have time, there's a bonus evaluation point you could do. Taxing assets with price inelastic supply, such as housing or land, may be more effective than national insurance rises for funding extra government spending. This may reduce the extent to which the incentives to hire and work are harmed, while ensuring enough tax revenue is available to fund the extra government spending. That's it, that's the essay. What should you learn from this essay? Well, note the analysis. Detailed chains of reasoning, no gaps, that links back to the question. Those AD and multiplier chains, those opportunity cost chains, detailed, linking to the question. Evaluation paragraphs show how the points may undermine the previous analysis. So spare capacity, level of interest rates, the assumption that government spending increases necessarily lead to high budget deficits, and challenging that assumption. These are all typical evaluation points. Context, I've used examples throughout, so know your macro facts or macro case studies. A conclusion that answers the question and justifies the answer. So this answer would likely score either 4 marks or close to it. There are lots of other points you could have written. So for example, crowding out and or crowding in. So crowding out is where you have an increase in government spending, say building hospitals, then there's more demand for the inputs needed to build the hospitals, such as concrete. And that increases input costs. And that's going to mean it's costlier for private firms to do their own construction projects, which would reduce investment. You could have more on the effects of higher taxes to pay for the extra government spending, how this could reduce AD and LRAS if you increase income tax, for example. Another point could be whether the government spending is funded by a sovereign wealth fund instead of borrowing. So if we have a wealth fund as a government, such as Norway's wealth fund, then we might not necessarily see an increase in the budget deficit when we want to increase government spending. The effects of other areas of government spending could also be considered. So welfare payments or infrastructure spending may have different effects. And there are many other points you could use as well. For more economic resources suitable for AQA Economics students, you can use my website, linked in the description. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to give a comment or drop a like if you found this helpful. Thank you.